Margaret Holloway stood in the warm kitchen of Willow Creek residence, carefully folding white napkins beside the dinner plates, while the smell of pot roast filled the house. Sunday dinners used to make her happy. They used to feel like family. Now they felt like work. Her daughter-in-law, Vanessa Reed, leaned casually against the doorway with her phone raised in front of her face. At first, Margaret assumed she was taking a picture of the table setting. Vanessa was always posting little pieces of her life online. Then Margaret heard her laughing. "Our live-in maid," Vanessa said to the camera. "At least she's good for something." Margaret froze with a napkin still in her hands. Vanessa giggled softly and tapped her screen before walking away like nothing had happened. A strange silence settled over the kitchen. Margaret slowly picked up her phone from the counter and opened social media. The video was already online. There she was, setting the table in her own home while strangers laughed in the comments below. But the comment that hurt most came from her son. Ethan Holloway had reacted with a laughing emoji. Not a defense, not a phone call, not even a private apology. Just laughter. Margaret stared at the screen for a long moment. Oddly enough, she didn't cry. The hurt inside her felt colder than tears. It was the kind of cold that arrived when something finally became clear. For over a year, Ethan and Vanessa had been living in her house temporarily while saving money for their own place in Ashford, North Carolina. During that time, Margaret had quietly become their cook, maid, grocery provider, laundress, and emergency bank account. And somewhere along the way, they had stopped seeing her as Ethan's mother. Now she was simply useful. Margaret calmly set her phone down, walked to the hallway closet, and slipped on her coat. She picked up her purse and car keys without saying a word to either of them. Nobody noticed her leaving. Outside, cold evening air brushed against her face as she climbed into her car. Instead of driving around to calm herself, she headed straight toward Silver Pines Inn on the edge of town. That night, alone in a quiet room with soft yellow lamplight, Margaret sat on the small balcony wrapped in a blanket. Then she opened her banking app. The grocery debit card attached to her account, the one Vanessa used almost daily, appeared on the screen. Margaret stared at it for 3 long seconds. Then she pressed cancel card. The next morning, Vanessa Reed stood at the checkout line inside Greenfield Market with a cart full of groceries, and her card was declined. Margaret woke early the next morning at Silver Pines Inn. Pale winter sunlight slipped through the curtains, painting soft gold across the room. For the first time in months, she felt no pressure to rush downstairs and prepare breakfast for someone else. No dishes, no laundry, no demands, only silence. She sat on the balcony with a cup of coffee balanced between her hands, while cold morning air drifted through the trees surrounding the inn. Somewhere in the distance, birds chirped softly. Then her phone buzzed. Vanessa. Margaret let it ring. Seconds later, another call came through, then another. Finally, a text message appeared. "Why is my card not working?" Margaret calmly sipped her coffee before locking her phone and setting it face down on the table beside her untouched croissant. For the first time in over a year, someone else's emergency was no longer hers. Around noon, Margaret drove home. The moment she stepped through the front door of Willow Creek residence, she heard hurried footsteps crossing the hardwood floor. Vanessa appeared first. Her cheeks were red with anger, and her expensive sunglasses sat pushed high on top of her blonde hair. What the hell happened at the store?" Vanessa snapped. "Do you know how embarrassing that was?" Margaret quietly removed her coat and hung it neatly by the door. "Yes," she answered calmly. "I canceled the card." Vanessa stared at her in disbelief. "You canceled it? Over a joke?" Ethan emerged from the living room looking exhausted already. as if he knew exactly how this conversation would go. "Mom," he said carefully, "you could have at least warned us." Margaret slowly turned toward him. "Warned you?" she repeated softly. "Did either of you warn me before posting that video online?" Neither of them answered. The silence in the hallway thickened. Vanessa crossed her arms defensively. "It wasn't even serious. My friends thought it was funny." Margaret looked directly at her. "I didn't." That simple sentence landed harder than yelling ever could. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Okay, maybe the post was insensitive, but canceling the card is extreme. How are we supposed to buy groceries now?" "With your own money," Margaret replied. Vanessa let out a sharp laugh. "Wow, so this is punishment?" "No," Margaret said evenly. "This is a boundary." The words seemed to confuse them both. Margaret walked past them into the kitchen. Dirty coffee mugs sat in the sink beside crumbs Vanessa had left on the counter the night before. Normally, Margaret would have cleaned everything immediately. Today, she simply ignored it. She opened the refrigerator, pulled out ingredients, and made herself a small turkey sandwich with sliced tomatoes and fresh lettuce. Only one plate, only one glass. Ethan lingered awkwardly nearby, while Vanessa paced angrily through the hallway. "Aren't you making lunch?" Ethan finally asked. Margaret placed chips beside her sandwich and looked up at him calmly. "No." He blinked. "Just no?" "You're both adults," she answered. "I assume you know how kitchens work." Vanessa muttered something under her breath and stormed upstairs. Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table and took her first peaceful bite in months. Upstairs, cabinet doors slammed violently. But downstairs, Margaret Holloway ate her lunch in complete silence. And for the first time in a very long time, silence felt wonderful. The next 2 days inside Willow Creek residence felt strangely unfamiliar. Not loud, not explosive, just tense. Margaret Holloway moved calmly through her home, while Ethan and Vanessa drifted around her like confused strangers. Nobody knew exactly how to behave now that the old routine had disappeared, especially Ethan. Wednesday morning began quietly. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows, while Margaret sat at the table reading the local newspaper with a cup of cinnamon tea warming her hands. For once, the kitchen belonged entirely to her. No social media videos playing loudly from Vanessa's phone. No dirty smoothie blender left in the sink. No requests, only peace. Then heavy footsteps came down the stairs. Ethan entered wearing gray slacks and a wrinkled blue dress shirt. His hair was still damp from the shower, and frustration already covered his face. "Mom To," he said quickly, "did you not do the laundry yesterday?" Margaret slowly lowered her newspaper. "No," she answered calmly. Ethan frowned in confusion. "But Wednesdays are laundry days." "For you," Margaret corrected gently. He blinked at her like she had spoken another language. "I need this shirt for a meeting in an hour," he said. "Everything upstairs is dirty." Margaret took another sip of tea. "The washing machine still works perfectly fine, Ethan." He stared at her for several long seconds. Then he laughed awkwardly. "Okay, seriously." "I am serious." Upstairs, Vanessa's voice floated through the hallway. "Ethan, did she shrink my white sweater again?" Margaret nearly smiled into her tea. Ethan rubbed his forehead. "Mom, come on. Vanessa has Pilates this morning, and I'm already late." Margaret folded the newspaper neatly beside her plate. "Then perhaps one of you should do laundry tonight." Silence. Ethan looked genuinely stunned. Margaret realized something uncomfortable in that moment. Her son had become so used to being taken care of that basic adult responsibilities now felt unfair to him. The realization hurt far more than Vanessa's stupid video. "She's your wife," Margaret continued softly, "not your daughter. And I'm your mother, Ethan, not your housekeeper." Upstairs, a door slammed loudly. Vanessa stormed down moments later, wearing expensive workout clothes and irritation across her face. "This is honestly getting ridiculous," she snapped. "You've been acting weird for days." Margaret met her eyes calmly. "No," she replied. "I've been acting differently. There's a difference." Vanessa crossed her arms. All this because of one harmless joke online. Margaret stood slowly from the table and carried her empty teacup to the sink. "It wasn't harmless to me." Vanessa rolled her eyes dramatically. "You're making this house miserable." Margaret turned around. "This house has belonged to me for 27 years, she said quietly. "If it feels miserable now, perhaps you should ask yourselves, why?" For once, Vanessa had no immediate response. The silence stretched awkwardly between them. Then Ethan muttered, "Forget it," grabbed his laptop bag and headed for the basement laundry room. Margaret listened as cabinets downstairs opened and closed clumsily. A moment later, the washing machine rattled loudly to life. Vanessa stared toward the basement in disbelief. "How he seriously doesn't even know how to separate colors," she whispered. Margaret shrugged lightly. "He'll learn." Vanessa scoffed angrily before grabbing her oversized purse and storming toward the front door. Just before leaving, she paused. "You know what?" she snapped. "Ever since retiring, all you do is sit around this house looking for problems." Margaret's expression never changed. "No, Vanessa," she answered quietly. "I finally started noticing them." The front door slammed hard enough to shake the picture frames on the wall. Then silence returned again. Margaret looked around the kitchen slowly. For the first time in over a year, nobody expected her to clean up after them immediately. Nobody expected lunch. Nobody expected service. And suddenly the entire house felt lighter. Later that afternoon, Margaret walked through the downstairs living room, carrying a large woven basket. Vanessa's magazines covered the coffee table. Ethan's sneakers blocked the hallway. Phone chargers tangled across the sofa. Shopping bags littered the floor beside the staircase. Margaret stood there quietly for a long moment. Then she began gathering every single item, one by one, without anger, without emotion, just ownership. By sunset, the basket sat neatly outside Ethan and Vanessa's upstairs bedroom door. And downstairs, the living room finally looked like hers again. Thursday morning arrived cold and gray over Ashford. Margaret Holloway stood in the downstairs hallway holding an old framed photograph in her hands. The picture had been taken nearly 15 years earlier, on a summer trip to Charleston. Ethan was smiling beside her, sunburned and happy, one arm wrapped around her shoulders. Back then, he used to call her every day just to talk. Now he barely looked at her unless he needed something. Margaret quietly set the photograph back on the shelf and continued straightening the living room. For months, she had slowly retreated from her own home without even realizing it. Ethan and Vanessa had spread themselves across every corner downstairs, while Margaret made herself smaller and smaller to avoid conflict. Not anymore. That morning, she dragged her favorite old wingback chair out from the dusty guest room storage corner. The chair was soft blue with slightly faded arms and a tiny burn mark near the cushion from a fireplace accident years ago. Vanessa hated it. Margaret loved it. With slow determination, she pushed the chair directly beside the large front window, where warm sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor each afternoon. Then she placed a small reading table beside it, along with her knitting basket and favorite lamp. Simple, comfortable, hers. By noon, the downstairs looked completely different. The clutter was gone. The silence felt cleaner somehow. Margaret sat in her reclaimed corner with a mystery novel open in her lap when she heard the front door unlock sharply. Vanessa stepped inside carrying shopping bags and immediately froze. "What is that doing there?" she demanded. Margaret glanced up from her book calmly. What is what doing where? That chair, Vanessa snapped. It makes the room look old. Margaret marked her page carefully before answering. It is old. Vanessa dropped her shopping bags dramatically onto the floor. Ethan and I already talked about redesigning this room. We wanted something modern and open. Margaret blinked slowly. We? Vanessa crossed her arms. Yes, we live here too. Margaret studied her quietly for a long moment. Then she closed her book. No, she said softly. You stay here. Vanessa's expression hardened instantly. That's rude. No, Margaret replied evenly. What's rude is redecorating someone else's home while calling them your maid online. Vanessa looked away first. For a second, actual embarrassment flickered across her face before irritation returned to cover it again. You're still stuck on that? Margaret leaned back comfortably in the chair. No, she answered. I simply learned from it. The front door opened again before Vanessa could respond further. Ethan walked in carrying takeout bags that smelled strongly of fried chicken and garlic fries. Hey, he said carefully, instantly sensing tension. Everything okay? No, Vanessa answered quickly. Your mother moved this awful chair back in here after we agreed we were replacing it. Ethan looked between them tiredly. Mom. Margaret raised one eyebrow. Are you about to explain to me which furniture belongs in my living room? Ethan immediately stopped talking. Vanessa threw her hands into the air dramatically. This is unbelievable. Margaret stood slowly and walked toward the kitchen. No, she replied calmly. What was unbelievable was watching strangers laugh at me online while the two people living under my roof joined in. Silence followed her words. Heavy silence. The kind nobody could easily argue against. Margaret opened a cabinet and pulled out a single wine glass. Only one. Vanessa noticed immediately. You didn't even ask if we wanted dinner. Margaret uncorked a bottle of white wine. You already bought food. Ethan shifted awkwardly. We thought maybe we could all eat together. Margaret poured her wine carefully. Why? She asked quietly. So one of you can film me again. Neither of them spoke. Margaret carried her glass back toward the living room. Halfway there, she paused. Oh, she added calmly. And from now on, please keep your belongings upstairs. I'm done cleaning shared clutter downstairs. Vanessa stared at her. You moved our things? I returned them. Vanessa stormed upstairs seconds later. Her footsteps pounding violently overhead. A bedroom door slammed hard enough to shake the ceiling light. Ethan remained standing awkwardly in the kitchen. For the first time since moving home, he looked genuinely uncomfortable inside the house. Margaret settled peacefully into her chair beside the window. Outside, evening sunlight stretched across the yard. Inside, Willow Creek residence finally felt a little more like home again. The tension inside Willow Creek residence settled into something cold and permanent over the next few days. Nobody fought openly anymore. That almost made things worse. Ethan moved carefully through the house like someone trying not to wake a sleeping animal. Vanessa, meanwhile, alternated between icy silence and dramatic sighs loud enough for everyone to hear. Margaret ignored both. Saturday morning arrived bright and unusually warm for early spring. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows while Margaret watered the small herb plants lined along the counter. For once, the downstairs felt peaceful. Then Ethan walked in, holding his phone. Mom, he began cautiously. Can we talk about summer vacation? Margaret already knew where this conversation was going. Every year since Ethan was a teenager, she helped pay for the family beach trip. Even after he and Vanessa moved in, Margaret usually covered part of the rental house because Ethan insisted they were trying to save. Margaret rinsed basil leaves under cool water. What about it? She asked calmly. Ethan relaxed slightly, mistaking her tone for agreement. Vanessa found this really nice beach place near Blue Water Cove. We were thinking maybe the same arrangement as last year. Margaret dried her hands slowly with a towel. No. Ethan blinked. No, I won't be paying for your vacation this year. The words landed heavily in the room. Ethan stared at her. Why not? Margaret folded the towel neatly beside the sink. Because I'm done financing two healthy adults who are perfectly capable of paying their own bills. Vanessa entered halfway through the conversation, instantly catching the tension. What happened now? She asked sharply. Your mother just canceled our vacation plans, Ethan muttered. Vanessa looked horrified. You can't be serious. Margaret met her eyes calmly. Oh, I'm very serious. Vanessa laughed bitterly. Wow. So now you're punishing us financially too? Margaret walked past her toward the hallway. No, she replied evenly. I'm finally spending my money on myself. An hour later, the handyman arrived. Vanessa nearly dropped her iced coffee when she saw him carrying a toolbox through the front door. What's going on? She demanded. Margaret signed paperwork calmly at the entry table. I'm having new locks installed. Why? My bedroom and office. Vanessa frowned immediately. Why would you lock those? Margaret looked up slowly. Privacy. The word alone made Vanessa defensive. We don't snoop. Margaret said nothing at first. Instead, memories quietly surfaced. Vanessa borrowing expensive hand cream from Margaret's bathroom without asking. Vanessa looking for tape inside Margaret's office drawers. Vanessa dropping random shopping bags inside Margaret's bedroom because there was space. Tiny invasions. Constant invasions. Day after day, Margaret had tolerated them because confrontation felt exhausting. Now exhaustion no longer mattered. The handyman disappeared down the hallway, while drilling noises echoed softly through the house. Vanessa folded her arms tightly. This is honestly insane, she muttered. Margaret sat peacefully in her wing-back chair with a book. No, she answered without looking up. What's insane is expecting unrestricted access to rooms that don't belong to you. Upstairs, Ethan remained silent. That silence bothered Vanessa even more. By early afternoon, the work was finished. The handyman handed Margaret 2 small brass keys. She thanked him warmly and slipped them into her cardigan pocket. The sound of the office door locking moments later echoed through the hallway like a final decision. Vanessa immediately walked over and twisted the handle. Locked. She rattled it harder. Seriously, she snapped. Margaret looked up from her chair. Yes. Vanessa spun around angrily. What exactly are you hiding in there? Margaret's expression never changed. My peace. Silence crashed through the room. Vanessa stared at her in disbelief before storming upstairs again. A few seconds later, Margaret heard muffled arguing behind the closed bedroom door. Ethan's lower voice, Vanessa's sharper one. Then silence. Margaret leaned back in her chair slowly. For the first time in over a year, parts of the house were becoming unreachable to everyone except her. And surprisingly, locked doors made her feel safe again. Later that evening, Margaret walked into the garage searching for gardening gloves. She stopped almost immediately. Brown moving boxes towered everywhere. Old lamps, unused gym equipment, suitcases, plastic storage bins. The entire garage had become Ethan and Vanessa's personal storage unit months ago. Meanwhile, Margaret's car sat outside in rain and pollen every single night. She stood there quietly for a long moment. Then she smiled faintly to herself. The garage would be next. Monday morning began with the sound of rain dripping steadily from the gutters outside Willow Creek residence. Margaret Holloway stood inside the garage wearing old gardening gloves and sturdy sneakers. Dust floated through thin beams of sunlight that slipped between the cracked garage door panels. For months, she had avoided coming in there unless absolutely necessary. Now she understood why. The space no longer belonged to her. Towering stacks of cardboard boxes lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Ethan and Vanessa's unused furniture crowded the corners beside forgotten exercise equipment. Broken lamps, old suitcases, and plastic bins labeled Christmas, winter clothes, and kitchen stuff. Meanwhile, Margaret's sedan sat outside every night collecting pollen, bird droppings, and rainwater. She stared around the garage quietly. Then she rolled up her sleeves. 3 hours later, sweat dampened the collar of her sweater despite the cool air. One by one, Margaret carried every box outside to the covered backyard carport. She worked slowly but carefully, making sure nothing was damaged. She wasn't throwing their belongings away. She was simply reclaiming her own space. By noon, the garage floor finally appeared again. Margaret paused in the center of the empty space, breathing hard. Her back ached, and her hands were sore. But satisfaction warmed her chest. For the first time in nearly a year, she could actually see the walls of her garage. She climbed into her car, turned the key, and slowly drove inside. The garage door closed behind her with a soft mechanical hum. Margaret sat there for several seconds in complete silence. It felt absurdly good. That evening, Ethan arrived home first. The moment he saw the stacked belongings under the carport, he froze halfway up the driveway. "What the hell?" he muttered. A few seconds later, the front door burst open. "Mom!" Margaret looked up calmly from her chair beside the window, where she was sorting old photographs into albums. Ethan stood in the hallway staring at her. "Why is all our stuff outside?" Margaret placed another photograph neatly into its sleeve. "Because my garage is for my car." Ethan looked genuinely shocked. "But there's no room upstairs for all that." Margaret nodded once. "Then perhaps it's time to decide what you actually need." Before Ethan could respond, Vanessa's car pulled into the driveway. The second she stepped outside and saw the boxes, her face twisted with outrage. "Oh my God," she snapped, storming through the front door. "You moved our things outside like trash." Margaret calmly closed the photo album in her lap. "The carport is covered." "That's not the point." "No," Margaret said evenly. "The point is that I've been parking on the street, while your unused junk occupied my garage." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "You're unbelievable lately." Margaret stood slowly. "No, I've simply stopped making myself uncomfortable so other people can stay comfortable." Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. "You're destroying this family over one stupid video." The accusation hung heavily in the room. For a moment, Ethan looked down at the floor instead of at either woman. Margaret noticed that small detail mattered. Because for the first time, Ethan didn't immediately defend his wife. Margaret walked toward the kitchen calmly. "This family wasn't damaged by a video," she said quietly. "It was damaged the moment basic respect disappeared." Silence followed her words. Vanessa looked frustrated by Margaret's calmness more than anything else. She wanted an emotional fight. Margaret refused to give her one. Instead, Margaret opened the refrigerator and pulled out fresh vegetables for dinner, only enough for herself. Ethan lingered awkwardly in the hallway. "Mom," he said quietly, "you could have at least asked before moving everything." Margaret sliced tomatoes carefully on the cutting board. "And you could have asked before turning my garage into a storage unit." Again, silence. Upstairs, Vanessa began stomping around angrily, muttering complaints loud enough for the entire house to hear. Margaret ignored every word. That night, after dinner, she stepped outside onto the back porch with a cup of tea. Rain had finally stopped. The air smelled clean and cool. Through the open garage, she could see her car safely parked inside where it belonged. For the first time in months, Margaret felt something unfamiliar settle quietly inside her chest. Not anger, not sadness, control. Sunday mornings used to be Margaret Holloway's favorite time of the week. She would wake early, brew fresh coffee, fry bacon in the quiet kitchen, and set out pastries before Ethan even came downstairs. Years ago, those mornings had felt warm and familiar. Now they felt tense before the day even began. Margaret walked into the kitchen shortly after 8, wearing a soft cream cardigan and slippers. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then she noticed the refrigerator. The shelves were strangely empty. Margaret opened the door slowly. Her favorite imported cheese was gone. The fresh strawberries she bought 2 days earlier had disappeared. So had the yogurt, smoked turkey slices, and the bakery rolls she planned to eat for breakfast. In their place sat a single sticky note written in Vanessa's sharp handwriting. "Since you want everything separate now, we're separating food too. We borrowed a few things because we haven't shopped yet. We'll replace them later." Margaret stared at the note for several long seconds. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. Not because the situation was funny, because it was transparent. Vanessa wanted a reaction. She wanted a fight. Margaret quietly folded the note and placed it on the counter. Upstairs, she could hear muffled laughter from the bedroom television. Instead of responding, Margaret calmly got dressed and left the house. The morning air outside felt cool and refreshing as she drove across Ashford toward Oak and Vine Gourmet Market. For nearly an hour, she wandered peacefully through the small upscale grocery store, selecting exactly what she wanted. Fresh salmon, imported cheese, a bottle of white wine, dark chocolate, fresh herbs, good coffee. Things she used to feel guilty buying for herself. Today she felt no guilt at all. On her drive home, Margaret stopped at an appliance store and purchased a compact refrigerator. By early afternoon, 2 delivery workers carried the small stainless steel fridge directly into her locked office. Margaret thanked them warmly. Then she carefully stocked the shelves herself. Everything organized, everything untouched, everything hers. That evening, Ethan and Vanessa returned home carrying takeout coffee cups. Vanessa immediately opened the kitchen refrigerator, then paused. "What the hell?" she muttered. The shelves were nearly empty except for condiments and a carton of eggs. Ethan walked over beside her. "Mom," he called toward the living room. "Didn't you go grocery shopping?" Margaret looked up calmly from her book. "I did." Vanessa frowned. "Then where's the food?" Margaret turned a page slowly before answering. "In my office refrigerator." Silence. Vanessa stared at her in disbelief. "You bought your own fridge?" "Yes." "That's ridiculous." Margaret shrugged lightly. "You wanted separate food." Vanessa slammed the refrigerator door. "This is so petty." "No," Margaret replied evenly. "Petty would have been throwing away your groceries. I simply stopped providing mine." Ethan rubbed his forehead tiredly. "Mom, come on, we all live together." Margaret closed her book softly. "Living together does not mean unlimited access to everything I buy." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "So now we need permission to eat?" "You need responsibility," Margaret corrected. The room fell silent again. For a brief moment, Margaret saw something flicker across Ethan's face. Embarrassment. Real embarrassment. Not anger. Not irritation. The uncomfortable realization that his 58-year-old mother had become the most independent adult in the house. Vanessa, however, remained furious. "You're acting like we're strangers." Margaret met her eyes calmly. "No," she answered quietly. "I'm acting like someone who finally realized she was being used." Vanessa opened her mouth immediately, but Ethan interrupted first. "Enough." Both women looked at him. His voice sounded exhausted, not angry, just tired. He glanced toward Margaret awkwardly. "I'll go grocery shopping tonight." Margaret nodded once. "A good idea." Vanessa looked stunned. "You're seriously taking her side?" Ethan exhaled heavily. "I'm saying we probably should have been buying our own groceries a long time ago." The silence that followed felt entirely different from the others before it. Sharper, more honest. Vanessa grabbed her purse angrily. "Fine," she snapped. "Let's go." A few minutes later, the front door slammed behind them. Margaret remained alone downstairs. She walked quietly to her office and unlocked the door. Inside, soft lamplight glowed warmly across the room. The tiny refrigerator hummed gently in the corner beside her desk. Margaret poured herself a glass of chilled white wine and sat down peacefully. For the first time in years, nobody could take anything from her without permission. And somehow that small refrigerator represented far more than food. Friday evening arrived with heavy clouds rolling across the sky above Ashford. Margaret Holloway sat peacefully in her wingback chair beside the living room window with a blanket across her lap and a half-finished crossword puzzle resting on the side table. The house had grown noticeably quieter during the past week. Not happier, just quieter. Ethan had started doing his own laundry without complaining. He bought groceries twice that week and even cleaned the kitchen after cooking pasta one night. Vanessa, however, remained angry. She moved through the house with cold silence and sharp little acts of defiance. Cabinet doors closing too loudly, icy stares across the hallway, dramatic sighs whenever Margaret entered a room. Margaret ignored all of it. Outside, headlights suddenly swept across the front yard. Margaret glanced up. 2 unfamiliar cars pulled into the driveway. A strange feeling settled immediately in her stomach. Moments later, the front door burst open. Vanessa entered first, wearing a bright smile Margaret had not seen in weeks. Right behind her walked a middle-aged couple carrying rolling suitcases. Walter and Cynthia Reed, Vanessa's parents. Margaret slowly lowered her crossword book. "How well, surprise," Vanessa announced cheerfully. "Mom and Dad decided to spend the weekend with us." Margaret noticed Ethan standing awkwardly behind everyone near the doorway. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Interesting. Vanessa's parents stepped farther inside. Walter offered a polite smile. "Hope we're not imposing." Margaret stood calmly from her chair. "Good evening," she said warmly. "Long drive?" 5 hours, Cynthia answered tiredly. Vanessa grabbed one of the suitcases immediately. "Come on," she said brightly. "The guest room's downstairs." Margaret remained completely still. Vanessa walked confidently toward the guest room door beside the hallway. Then she stopped. The handle wouldn't turn. She frowned and tried again harder. Locked. Vanessa spun around sharply. "Why is this door locked?" Margaret folded her hands calmly in front of her. "Because that room is no longer a guest room." Silence fell instantly. Vanessa blinked. "What?" "I turned it into a craft room last week." The color drained from Vanessa's face. "You did what?" Margaret kept her tone perfectly calm. "I needed the space." Walter and Cynthia exchanged an uncomfortable glance near the doorway. Vanessa lowered her voice into an angry whisper. "My parents are staying here this weekend." "You should have asked before inviting overnight guests," Margaret replied evenly. Vanessa stared at her in disbelief. "You can't seriously expect them to sleep upstairs with us." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "You have a large upstairs sitting area and a pull-out couch." "That's not the point." "No," Margaret answered quietly. "The point is that this is still my home." The words landed heavily. Ethan finally stepped forward. "Mom." Margaret looked directly at him. "Did you know they were coming?" His silence answered for him. Vanessa threw up her hands dramatically. "This is unbelievable. You're embarrassing us on purpose." Margaret's expression never changed. "No, Vanessa, embarrassment is posting videos online calling your host a maid." Walter cleared his throat awkwardly. "Maybe we should get a hotel," he muttered quietly. "No!" Vanessa snapped immediately. "This is ridiculous." But Margaret noticed something important. Neither of Vanessa's parents looked angry with her. They looked uncomfortable with their daughter. That mattered. Ethan quietly picked up the suitcases without another word. "I'll set up the upstairs couch," he said softly. Vanessa stared at him. "You're seriously okay with this?" He looked exhausted. I'm saying arguing isn't helping. For the first time since all of this began, Vanessa looked slightly cornered, not defeated, but exposed. Margaret stepped politely aside so everyone could move upstairs. Cynthia paused briefly near the staircase. "I'm sorry," she said quietly to Margaret. "We didn't realize—" Margaret offered a small, gracious smile. "It's all right. I hope you enjoy your visit." The upstairs bedroom door closed moments later. Then came muffled arguing, Vanessa's sharp voice, Ethan trying to calm her down, Walter speaking quietly, Cynthia sounding embarrassed. Margaret returned peacefully to her chair beside the window. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the glass. Inside, the downstairs remained quiet and warm. Margaret picked up her crossword puzzle again, but she didn't immediately continue. Instead, she sat silently for several moments, listening to the distant tension upstairs. For over a year, she had bent herself smaller and smaller to avoid making others uncomfortable inside her own home. Now the discomfort belonged to someone else, and strangely enough, Margaret slept better that night than she had in months. By Monday morning, Vanessa's parents were gone. The goodbye at Willow Creek residence had been painfully polite. Cynthia hugged Ethan tightly before leaving and barely looked at Vanessa during the final few minutes. Walter shook Margaret's hand warmly and thanked her for opening the home. Vanessa remained silent the entire time. The moment the cars disappeared down the street, the tension inside the house returned instantly. Margaret spent the afternoon quietly working in the garden. The cool spring air smelled of damp soil and fresh flowers, while she trimmed dead branches from her hydrangea bushes. Peaceful work, simple work, work nobody expected her to do for them. The back door opened behind her. Ethan stepped outside slowly with both hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "Mom," he said carefully. Margaret kept trimming. "Yes?" He hesitated. "What happened this weekend?" "It was awkward." Margaret nodded once. "I imagine it was." Ethan sighed heavily. "Vanessa's really upset." Margaret finally looked up at him, and the single word caught him off guard. For years, Ethan had grown used to Margaret immediately softening whenever he looked uncomfortable. He expected reassurance, comfort, a quick apology just to make tension disappear. This time, none came. "She thinks you embarrassed her in front of her parents," Ethan muttered. Margaret set the garden shears down carefully. "Oh, interesting," she said quietly, "because humiliating someone publicly seems to bother Vanessa only when it happens to her." Ethan looked away immediately. That silence told Margaret everything. For the first time, he understood the comparison. Margaret reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a large white envelope. Ethan frowned. "What's that?" Margaret handed it to him calmly. "A rental agreement." His eyes widened instantly. "What?" "You and Vanessa have lived here for over a year," Margaret said evenly. "Starting next month, you'll either contribute properly or make other living arrangements." Ethan opened the envelope slowly. Inside sat neatly typed paperwork. Monthly rent, utility contribution, household expectations, 3-month notice requirement if they refused. Ethan stared down at the papers like they were written in another language. "You're charging us rent." Margaret met his eyes calmly. "Yes?" "But, Mom, we're saving for a house, and I'm paying for one," Margaret replied. Silence stretched between them. A cold breeze moved softly through the yard. Ethan lowered the papers slightly. "We can't afford market rent and save quickly." Margaret nodded once. "Then perhaps your timeline needs adjusting." The truth of adulthood sat heavily between them. No anger, no screaming, just reality. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face. "Vanessa's going to lose it." Margaret picked up her garden shears again. "That's her decision." He looked down at the contract once more. "If you're serious about this." Margaret resumed trimming branches. "I should have been serious much sooner. That evening, the argument upstairs exploded almost immediately. Margaret sat downstairs in her wingback chair with a cup of chamomile tea, while muffled voices echoed through the ceiling. Vanessa's voice rose sharply. "This is insane." Then Ethan's. "She's not backing down." More yelling followed. Financial stress, apartment prices, accusations, blame. At one point, Vanessa shouted something about choosing sides. Margaret quietly turned another page in her novel. Hours passed. Eventually, the house fell silent. Near midnight, soft footsteps descended the stairs. Ethan appeared in the hallway looking exhausted. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes. For a moment, he looked much older than 32. "She thinks you hate her," he said quietly. Margaret closed her book. "I don't hate Vanessa." "Then why are you doing this?" Margaret studied her son carefully, because despite everything, she still loved him enough to answer honestly. "I'm doing this because I finally realized something, Ethan." He waited silently. Margaret's voice remained calm. If people never experience consequences, they eventually mistake kindness for weakness. The words settled deeply between them. Ethan looked down at the rental agreement still in his hands. For the first time since moving into Willow Creek residence, he finally seemed to understand something important. His mother was no longer asking for respect. She was requiring it. The days after the rental agreement changed everything inside Willow Creek residence. Not instantly, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, like a house settling after a storm. Vanessa stopped stomping through the hallways. The sarcastic comments disappeared. The icy silence remained. But now it carried something new beneath it. Uncertainty. Margaret noticed the difference almost immediately. For the first time since moving in, Ethan and Vanessa had started acting less like permanent guests and more like temporary people living in someone else's home. Ethan woke up earlier now. He packed his own lunches before work. He cleaned dishes without being asked. One Tuesday evening, Margaret even walked into the kitchen and found him reading instructions on the washing machine while folding towels carefully on the counter. The sight almost made her sad, not because he was struggling, because she realized how completely she had protected him from adulthood for far too long. Upstairs, however, things between Ethan and Vanessa were clearly becoming strained. Margaret never intentionally listened, but old houses carried sound easily. Late-night arguments drifted through vents and hallways. Money, apartments, budgets, credit cards, reality. Vanessa still blamed Margaret for everything. Ethan no longer sounded fully convinced. One rainy afternoon, Margaret returned home from a bookstore carrying 2 mystery novels and fresh flowers for the dining room table. As she entered the kitchen, she stopped. Ethan stood alone near the sink. The moment he saw her, he straightened awkwardly. "Hey," he said quietly. Margaret placed the flowers gently on the counter. "Hello." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan exhaled slowly. "I deleted the comment." Margaret looked at him calmly. "What comment?" "The laughing emoji." A long silence followed. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the refrigerator hummed quietly in the background. Finally, Ethan spoke again. "I should have defended you." Margaret remained still. "Yes," she answered softly. "You should have." He lowered his eyes immediately. The shame on his face looked genuine, not performative, not convenient, real. "I honestly didn't think about how humiliating it was," he admitted quietly. "Vanessa was laughing and I just reacted." Margaret studied her son carefully. For the first time in weeks, she saw traces of the thoughtful boy he used to be. Not the passive man who let disrespect happen to keep peace. The actual Ethan underneath all the avoidance. "I wasn't hurt because of strangers online," Margaret said quietly. "I was hurt because my son watched it happen and joined in." Ethan swallowed hard. I know. The simplicity of the answer mattered more than excuses ever could. Margaret nodded once. Thank you for admitting it. He looked surprised she said thank you at all. Then Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the rental agreement. Signed. We'll pay on the 1st of every month, he said quietly. Margaret accepted the envelope calmly. No late payments, she replied. A faint smile almost appeared on Ethan's face. Understood. Upstairs, a door closed sharply. Vanessa. The tension between them lingered like humidity before a thunderstorm. She still wants us to move out as soon as possible, Ethan admitted carefully. Margaret looked toward the staircase briefly. I think that's probably healthiest. He nodded slowly. Yeah. That single agreement carried years of unspoken truth inside it. Some people loved each other better from a distance. That evening, Margaret cooked salmon with roasted vegetables and opened a bottle of wine. Only for herself. But halfway through dinner, she noticed Ethan quietly making boxed pasta in the kitchen beside her. For once, the silence between them didn't feel hostile, just unfamiliar. As water boiled on the stove, Ethan glanced toward her carefully. You know, he said awkwardly, the living room actually looks better with your chair by the window. Margaret looked at him over the rim of her wine glass. Careful, she replied dryly. You're becoming observant in your old age. A tiny laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Upstairs, Vanessa remained distant. But downstairs, something subtle had shifted. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation. Understanding. And for Margaret Holloway, that mattered far more. 4 months later, Willow Creek residence was quiet again. Not the tense silence that once filled the house after arguments and slammed doors. Real quiet. Peaceful quiet. Margaret Holloway stood in the upstairs hallway, watching Ethan carry the last cardboard box toward the front door. Afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor, where stacks of storage bins had once crowded every corner. Now the hallway looked open again. Clean. Breathable. Vanessa stood outside near the moving truck, with her arms folded tightly while 2 movers secured furniture in the back. She barely looked toward the house anymore. Margaret noticed the difference immediately. Months earlier, Vanessa had moved through the home like it belonged to her. Now she avoided touching anything unnecessarily. The shift was impossible to miss. Ethan returned upstairs one final time, carrying a small lamp beneath his arm. This should be the last box, he said quietly. Margaret nodded. Your apartment ready? Mostly, he answered. It's smaller than we planned. Margaret smiled faintly. Most first apartments are. For a moment, Ethan looked like he wanted to say something more. Apologize again. Explain himself again. Instead, he simply stood there awkwardly in the hallway where he grew up. Margaret suddenly remembered him at 10 years old, racing toy cars across the same floor in pajamas. Life moved strangely fast. Mom, he said softly, I really am sorry. Margaret looked at him carefully. This time, the apology sounded different. Not defensive, not pressured. Adult. She stepped forward and adjusted the crooked collar of his jacket, the same way she had done when he was a boy. I know, she answered gently. His eyes lowered immediately, emotional in a way he clearly didn't want to show. Downstairs, Vanessa called impatiently from outside. Ethan, the movers are waiting, he sighed softly. Coming. At the front door, he hesitated again before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small set of keys. The upstairs keys. He placed them carefully into Margaret's hand. The simple gesture felt heavier than either of them expected. Take care of yourself, okay? He said quietly. Margaret closed her fingers around the keys. I plan to. Ethan gave a small nod before finally walking outside. The moving truck door slammed shut a few minutes later. Vanessa climbed into the passenger seat without looking back once. Ethan glanced toward the house one final time before the truck slowly pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street. And just like that, they were gone. Margaret stood alone in the front yard for several long seconds while cool spring wind moved gently through the trees. No anger remained inside her. No triumph either, only relief. That evening she walked slowly through every room downstairs. The kitchen counters were spotless. No abandoned coffee cups, no shopping bags, no voices upstairs. Inside the garage, her car sat exactly where it belonged. In the living room, her blue wingback chair rested beside the window with warm, golden sunlight falling across the cushion. Everything felt still, balanced. Margaret brewed fresh coffee the next morning before sunrise. She carried the steaming mug toward the chair and wrapped herself in a soft blanket as early light spread across the quiet room. Outside, birds moved through the garden she had reclaimed. Inside, no one expected breakfast. No one expected laundry. No one expected service. Margaret leaned back slowly and closed her eyes for a moment. She finally understood something important. The problem had never been cooking meals or helping family. Love often looked like service. The problem began when service became expectation, when kindness became entitlement, when respect disappeared. Vanessa once called her the live-in maid, as if that was all she had become. But the house, the money, the food, the rooms, the garage, none of it had ever belonged to them. Margaret hadn't thrown anyone away in anger. She had simply stopped disappearing inside her own home. Morning sunlight warmed her face as she lifted the coffee cup to her lips. The silence around her no longer felt lonely. It felt earned, and somewhere deep inside herself, Margaret Holloway finally felt at home again.